Legislative the Indiana Legislative Oral History Initiative. In review, the history, lessons, and resources that the Indiana Legislative Oral History Initiative can have. Before we begin, just a couple of reminders. Today's session is a hybrid format, so we have in-person and virtual attendees. This session is worth 1 LEU. For those that need continuing education credits, please be sure to fill out your LEU form that is located inside your packets today. Please save your questions till after the completion of the presentation. Due to the hybrid format of this session, we have asked the presenter to repeat all questions before giving their answer. For virtual attendees, please submit your questions in the chat box. We have a moderator who will relay your questions to the presenter. Just a reminder that following this presentation, to go visit our exhibitors located in our conflict-free break in the Great Hall. Our next session and virtual sessions will start at 1:30 p.m. Virtual attendees will have to leave this meeting and log into the next meeting link to join the escape rooms, the Library of Congress, and the U session. And with that out of the way, I am pleased to announce our presenter, Dr. Michelle Morano, Deputy Director of the Indiana Historical Bureau. Thank you for being here.
Switch spots here real quick.
Let's get out of your way.
All right. Oh, you can move my stuff if you need to. All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Government Information Day 2024. I am thrilled to be here with you this morning, and I am just going to jump right on in. My name is Michelle Marino, and I am the Deputy Director of the Indiana Historical Bureau. And just to contextualize a little bit about who IHB is and what it is that we do, the Historical Bureau is one of 3 divisions of the Indiana State Library, along with public services and also statewide services. And within the Bureau's structure, we have 3 departments: the Public History Department, our Digital Initiatives Department, and Rare Books and Manuscripts as well. So the Historical Bureau was really born out of the state centennial celebrations in 1915 and 1916. The Indiana General Assembly founded what was called the Indiana Historical Commission to provide, and I quote, for the editing and publication of historical materials and for a historical and educational celebration of the Indiana Centennial. So the thinking was that as Hoosiers celebrated 100 years of statehood in 1916, a better understanding of the state's history would give them a sense of identity and community. So we then evolved to our own state agency. In 1925, we were still tasked with promoting and publishing Indiana history, still as a way to sort of create this shared sense of identity and community and keeping a record of the past. So we merged formally with the library again in 2018. There's been various moments over the past 100 or so years where we've been connected with the State Library and the Historical Society, but then split back apart. But in 2018, we merged again to become a division of the library, again with public services and statewide services. But our mission has remained the same essentially from back 100 years ago when we were tasked with, again, providing publications. So our current mission is providing publications, programs, and other opportunities for Indiana citizens of all ages to learn and teach about the history of their communities, the state of Indiana, and their relationship to the nation and the world. So we sort of consider ourselves to be a public history research institute of sorts, which is sort of an oxymoron, right? But essentially we do original research, do a deep dive into that, and then translate what we learn into a variety of different public programs. So we offer a lot of different programs and resources and partner with organizations across the state on a variety of history initiatives. So I just want to briefly touch on a few here. One, we do a history blog called Untold Indiana. Formerly, that was called the Indiana History Blog. We conduct original research on Indiana history based on primary sources. We have a podcast, which is a narrative storytelling podcast since 2017 called Talking Hoosier History. We have an Indiana Almanac where essentially for every day of the year, we have a little snippet or story from across the state that just features various Indiana history events, various people, things that have happened, again, across the state. And then we are involved in a variety of different outreach and partnerships with variety of organizations, from the Historical Society to humanities to public libraries, and even local historical societies and universities as well. However, the Bureau has been tasked with two mandated programs from the General Assembly. One is our State Historical Marker Program, which we have been operating since the mid-1940s. We have over 750 historical markers across the state, except for in Jay County. They're the last holdout. If anyone here is from Jay County, I always put this plug in. We need a marker in Jay County. But we have 750 markers from across the state. That is a public-driven program where we partner with local applicants, local organizations on the ground to tell the rich and diverse history of our state, but emphasizing stories that have statewide or national significance. The other, more recent legislatively mandated program is the oral history of the General Assembly, which came about in 2017. And that is the project that we are going to focus on today. So the oral history project that emerged in 2017 was actually not really a new idea per se. First off, in 1987, the Indiana Historical Bureau, who at the time was under the leadership of Pam Bennett, and then also the Select Committee on the Centennial History of the Indiana General Assembly. That is a mouthful for 9 a.m. I haven't had enough coffee to get that out correctly. But together, the Bureau and this Select Committee partnered to publish a book titled The Centennial History of the Indiana General Assembly, which was by Justin E. Walsh. And this book was published to commemorate the 100th session of the Indiana General Assembly, which was held in 1977 and 1978. And the preface of that book stated, and I quote, "The history of any legislature is a story of people, the actions and events they shaped, and those that shaped their public service. This volume is a written record of the Indiana legislature, the first such history of any legislature in the nation." So this book took over a decade to be completed, but covered the first 100 years of, or not 100 years, first 100 sessions of the Indiana General Assembly from 1816 to 1978. And I know that's a little bit confusing because we keep saying centennial, but our General Assembly used to meet every other year until the early 1970s. So that's why the timing is off there. But once this book was published in 1987, there really was no more history written about the General Assembly. So in the early 2000s, there were discussions in various historical organizations and then with the General Assembly and legislators around perhaps starting an oral history project to sort of pick up where Walsh had left off, and then maybe even to have a second complementary publication to, again, cover the next few decades. So they really recognized this need, but the proposed bills didn't go anywhere, mainly due to budget issues at the time and then also 9/11. But the idea was picked back up in 2016 into 2017 under Chandler Leidy, who was then the director of the Historical Bureau, this time focusing more on the oral history aspect of the project, starting an oral history project. So particularly, the Bureau was wanting to make sure that we were learning from the legislators themselves about what issues they thought were important, how Indiana government and the state itself was changing over time, about how the General Assembly operated, particularly behind the scenes. So Chandler had stated at the time, and I quote, "So you might think it is odd that a bunch of legislators who have power need to do this oral history. But the fact of the matter is, lawmaking, a lot of it is done not only on the floors of the chambers, but also over dinner, backyard barbecues, socializing in the hallways and stuff." So we were really wanting to get those stories, right? The ones that were not in the papers, not in the voting records, not in the House and Senate journals. What was happening behind the scenes? And then the secondary purpose of the project was also to create primary documents for historians to use, the oral histories themselves being these primary documents, right? And create sort of a research archives from this. So House Bill 1100 was proposed in 2017. The bill was authored by Representative Matt Lehman, a Republican from Bern, Indiana, who was inspired by the Walsh book and stated, "So many things have happened since '78 that I think years down the road, scholars or students, but also just the general public would, I think, find somewhat fascinating." So this bill that passed in 2017 basically required the Bureau to establish and maintain an oral history of the General Assembly, and also to provide info from the project to the Legislative Services Agency upon request to help with their biographical database of legislators, and then also to submit reports on the project as requested. So, enter stage left, Dr. Marino. I was teaching at a small liberal arts school in Nebraska, teaching American history there and also oral history. But I am from Indiana originally and was looking to return to my home state. And so I was hired on as the historian to spearhead this project. So it is very near and dear to my heart. We obviously were starting this project from scratch. While a lot of ideas had been thrown around, nothing had really been established. And first of all, we needed a name, right, to get this project going. And there is nothing state government likes more than a good acronym. So thus born was the ILOHI, the Indiana Legislative Oral History Initiative. And I also started looking to other states who had done similar projects. While we were building ours from scratch, other states had done oral histories of legislators or general assemblies. Nevada had a pretty robust program, Arizona, California, Texas had done one, but where they were actually interviewing legislators in office. Oklahoma had done one where they focused on women who had served in their state legislatures. So again, we were starting to conduct research and piece together what other folks had done while we were building up our own program, but there was really no need to reinvent the wheel, and we should sort of learn from the mistakes and successes of these other projects and see what lessons could be learned. So we really began by setting some project parameters. And a few things we settled on fairly quickly and really implemented right away. The first of which being is we had decided that we were only going to interview legislators after they got out of office. There would be a lot of politicking if we were doing it while they were still in the General Assembly. There are benefits and drawbacks to doing it both ways, which maybe we have some time to talk about here at the end, in terms of memory and sort of freshness and that sort of thing, and established stories that can take on a life of their own after they're out of office. But we really thought it was important to sort of maintain that boundary between history and current politics. And so we really wanted to talk with them after they had gotten out of office. Another thing is we began focusing on creating sort of a spreadsheet heaven, for lack of a better word, I guess, of a variety of like collecting all the data from legislators by era. And I am not an Excel person. I am not a spreadsheet person. I still have nightmares thinking about these spreadsheets. It was a lot. But basically, we were gathering all this information about who had served when, where were the overlaps, where they were from, what had been their careers both before and after they had served in the General Assembly, what committees they had served on, where they were now, and then gathering contact information. How could we reach out to those folks? And I really felt like a detective or a private eye there for a while, where I'm like Googling, what their phone numbers were. It felt a little sketch, to be honest, but we found a lot of contact information for folks. But then also we were trying to prioritize and creating a list or identifying those that needed to be interviewed first. Who was getting up there in age? Did anyone have health issues that maybe we needed to interview them earlier in the process rather than later? Who had held prominent leadership positions that might be able to help us also connect and network to other legislators? So again, we were sort of creating that priority list. We also had to determine whether we were going to do oral histories that were just simply audio or whether we wanted to do video recorded interviews. And there's also pros and cons both ways for that. There was also a push for that from some of the legislators themselves, but ultimately it required more manpower and equipment and funding than we had available. And personally, from my own oral history experience, I think doing a recorded video interview actually changes the dynamic. People tend to perform more when they are actually on camera versus a small recorder that's just sat on a table between two people. So we decided that we were just going to focus on doing audio interviews. Also, I had to learn the ins and outs of Indiana politics. I had grown up here in Indiana, 25 miles southeast of Indianapolis, was familiar with a lot of the names of folks I was going to be talking with. And I'm a U.S. historian and an oral historian by training, but really doing a deep dive into a lot of the legislative issues and politics of the last few decades, many of which before I were alive, but familiarizing myself, what are key things we need to be exploring and learning about and asking about here. But then also, if we're going to be interviewing these legislators, who else was around? We're going to focus on the legislators themselves, but I set up a slew of meetings interviewing former lobbyists that had been in and around the General Assembly, legislative services, like the head of Legislative Services Agency that had worked closely with legislators, also journalists that had covered politics for the last couple decades. So familiarizing myself with those folks and then getting background information from them as well. And then also, what equipment were we going to use? Whether that would be like more high-tech equipment or just Sony recorders. What we decided was a basic, actually you can see in this photo here, a basic Sony recorder and then a higher end Tascam digital recorder because you always need to have backups, right? So we're still in sort of phase one of the project here, which is, I mentioned, from sort of 2017, 2018 until about 2019, 2020. But with gathering all that research and background information, it really, even as I was doing that, I really wanted to create a project description, establish a mission for the project with clearly defined goals of how we were going to be able to do this, and then be able to explain that to the General Assembly as well. And I think that this is really important, actually, information, yes, for our project, of course, but also for any oral history project, whether that's for a library or a historical society or community organizations. What I'm talking about next for the next few slides are just foundational pieces that anyone really needs to start an oral history project. So just briefly, the description that we decided upon for the project was simply that the legislative Oral History Initiative, the ILOHI, was founded by House Bill 1100 of the 120th Indiana General Assembly in 2017. It is an ongoing oral history project to record the history of the Indiana General Assembly from 1978 to the present from those who experienced it firsthand. Building on the work of the centennial history of the General Assembly from 1816 to 1978, i.e. the Walsh Book, the oral histories of the Indiana state legislators will not only provide a new history of the Indiana General Assembly and its members, but will also reveal the modern political and legislative processes that help shape our state. The ILOHI strives to provide a primary source collection that highlights the ways in which Indiana has changed over time, or over the course of the last 4 decades particularly, and the lawmakers' contributions towards and responses to this evolution. By sharing the history of the Indiana General Assembly and its influence on the people, processes, and institutions of the state, we can begin to more fully understand the role of Indiana in a national and global context. So you can see we're drawing on the same purpose as the Walsh Book, but also the mission of the Bureau too, right? Making sure we're in alignment on all fronts here. But then I also wanted to create a specific mission for the ILOHI project itself, which is simply the mission is to conduct, transcribe, preserve, and make publicly accessible oral histories with state legislators in order to better understand Hoosier political history. So then just briefly going through some of the goals, how do we then do those things, right? What is it that we're striving for with this project? One, just conducting the oral histories, detailing their lives. I actually want the full story of the legislator of how they even got to being elected for the General Assembly, their experiences, achievements, struggles in the IGA and in Indiana politics as public servants. We also wanted to focus on transcribing the interviews, not just having the audio, but also the transcription. And those are actually 2 separate primary documents, and each can serve a different function. So I thought it was very important to have both of those and to make those publicly available if possible. We also wanted to provide legislators biographical info to Legislative Services Agency, which was a requirement of the bill for their biographical database. Preserve the audio file and the transcript of the interview with the archive that we were creating, then also with the state library. And then to also create a user-friendly online archive and website to house the interviews and to make them publicly available, again, along as the transcripts, with the intention that we could eventually pull out like thematic excerpts about topics of public and historical interest. So here's what all the legislators said about X. Here's what they said about Y. And then we could eventually pull these audio snippets and then pieces from the transcripts out as well. We also wanted a goal of developing curriculum and resources for teachers to integrate oral history materials into the classroom at a variety of levels throughout the state, and then providing public outreach, such as this, to promote the oral histories, right? So briefly, a little bit about some of the key documents that we established from the get-go, which again are also really important for anyone that is starting an oral history project. The first is the narrator information sheet and voluntary consent form. This is an easy one-page handout that we would give to legislators that just detailed what the mission of the project was, what the goals of the project were, what they could also expect. When you come to this oral history interview, this is generally how long it would be, details like that. And then also that they are signing this document, confirming that we are not coercing them, we are not paying them to be a part of this project, that it is in fact voluntary, which is a really key part for oral history. The other is the release and deed of gift form. This is absolutely essential to any oral history project, no matter what level or what the topic is or who it is that you're interviewing. Having the release and deed of gift form essentially transfers the copyright from the narrator, the person that you are interviewing, to the person that is doing the interviewing, the interviewer. And then that also confirms the donation of that audio and any transcripts to a particular institution as outlined in the consent and release form. If you do not have this document when you are doing an oral history, you cannot use it, except under copyright law, like 10%, little snippets and educational pieces. And so this is really important when you're starting a project to make sure that you have this. Another thing that sometimes makes folks leery is they think they're transferring over like copyright to the stories or to the memories. You're not. You're simply just transferring the copyright of that particular audio file itself. They can always retell those stories, they can share those however they want, but then again, the Bureau and the library have ownership of that particular audio file, with any restrictions, though, that the legislators or the narrators put. Like, I do not want this released until X amount of years, or maybe I shouldn't have told that story about someone getting drunk afterwards. If you could cut that snippet, that would be great. So they can put some stipulations on it, but all that is worked out on the release and deed of gift form. Also, we established a core interview guide and questions. So for our project, knowing that we were going to be interviewing dozens, eventually hopefully hundreds of legislators, we wanted a core set of questions that we were going to make sure that we were going to ask every single legislator. So then we could gather both qualitative and some quantitative data from that, and then supplement that core interview guide with questions that we crafted specifically for that legislator, what we had already known about his or her background, or committees they had been on, or legislation that they had pushed forth, or what have you. But then also just a basic interview checklist of how we would be prepared and what we needed to go into these interviews. So once we had some of those foundational pieces established, we started the interviews. And by we, I do mean me at that point, was doing all of this stuff. But within the first few months there, I conducted about 10 to 15 interviews, starting with Morris Mills, who was a longtime legislator, very prominent in terms of orchestrating the state budget for many years. There's 3 pictures here, one with Virginia Blankenbaker, who was a delight of a person, former Senator Bob Meeks, and former Senator Gene Snowden. But actually, here's the list of sort of the first 10 or so interviews that we conducted. I also started the transcriptions right away, but for anyone who's done transcriptions before, those are very, very timely, time-consuming. So we didn't get super far into those when. In November of 2018, I actually moved into the deputy director role at the Historical Bureau. That's a little bit confusing. There is no director of the Bureau. So I then oversaw the Bureau, but report to the state librarian, but then found myself in the position needing to replace myself for a new oral historian. So in the fall of 2019, I hired on Ben Bauman to take us into the second phase of the project. Hopefully I have time to mention this at the end, because I think it is actually really important in understanding how important this project is. Ben just recently took another job in the nonprofit sector, so I'm sorry to have seen him go. but he moved into that position based on information that he learned from this project and understanding how politics were changing, and that he felt like that was a problem. So I feel like I worked myself into hiring someone new, so I guess shame on me, but I think that speaks to how important this project is. So when Ben came on board into phase 2 of the project, late 2019 into 2020, which, as you can imagine, that is not a date that we want to relive, which also caused some kinks for us here in the project, but really through the last 4 years. So immediately when Ben started, we conducted a few joint interviews with some major players, most notably Charlie Brown, who had been a longtime senator up from Gary, and then Pat Miller, who was a powerhouse in the legislature for many decades in Indianapolis, but as we transitioned from my management of the project to Ben. In part because 2020 hit and we couldn't do interviews for a while, at least not in person. That did give Ben time to focus on getting the online archive and website up and running. And so we really emphasized in that time period of making the interviews that we had already conducted public, and finding a user-friendly way to create an online archive, which really what we decided on is a website that we created with an embedded RSS feed. So you can listen to, and they are housed on this website. The interviews, because they're in this RSS feed, are now also available through a variety of other means in the same ways that you would listen to podcasts. So you can get them on Apple, you can get them on Spotify, and more recently we have also put them on YouTube. So we're hoping to reach a variety of different audiences with the interviews themselves. Even through the pandemic, though, we did try to conduct a lot of interviews, 1 to 2 per month at least, still concentrating on transcripts and trying to make our way through a backlog on that. So from really 2020 into 2024, Ben then conducted about 65 or so interviews. So now we have 80 plus interviews available to the public. All of those are online on the website. Ben also started a sort of sub-project called ILOHI in the schools, where after he had interviewed a former legislator, if they were open to the idea, he sort of worked with about 2 or 3 different legislators, that he would partner with high school teachers and also college professors to bring former legislators into the classroom, talk about the ILOHI project, and then also have the students sort of conduct an informal oral history interview with that legislator so they better understood, state government practices and what public service like that was like. And so there was some trial and error with that, particularly during the pandemic when no one knew how to use Zoom and you're just talking into the void and what have you, but we're learning from that, and he has done many of those interviews as well. As I mentioned, we were sort of affected by COVID, right as Ben was sort of getting into the swing of things with the program. So really within 6 months after he started, that did force us to shift to doing phone interviews instead of in-person interviews. There's also a lot of dynamics that change when you're not sitting face-to-face with someone and when you're doing it over Zoom or over a phone call. But it also, like I said, provided him a lot more time to work on the archive and then work through the backlog of things that we had amassed the first couple years. But another interesting sort of side effect of COVID-19 is that it is much harder to track down folks and get them to respond to the project. And I don't know what has happened exactly with that, but it's sort of like herding cats to get folks to return calls, to turn in their consent forms. They'll be like, oh yeah, that sounds great, I'd love to participate, and then sort of ghost us for months, or not show up to interviews. I don't know what has happened in COVID that has created that. We've been scheduled a lot of interviews and then people just not showed up. So we're still working through some of the details with that, but we were not unscathed by that either. So focusing on some of the things that we have learned over the past 5 or so years with the project. I know that I probably came into this project even with a lot of stereotypes about who legislators were and where they came from and why they were doing this sort of work. But one of the things that I learned very quickly is that many of them come from interesting backgrounds and not really what you might think of as they all went to law school and then they all did this, or they all had these political drives or ambitions from a young age. That really isn't what we are finding. Yes, some certainly went to law school and have been lawyers, but they're coming from insurance, they're farmers, they're teachers, they're really representative of a wide swath of Hoosiers. And so I thought that was really interesting as we piece that together. And the other is that there isn't this linear path to serving. There's not this, when I was 10, I knew I wanted to be in politics. And these are the steps that I took. I mean, people were coming in from issue driven. I was really upset that this happened, and that spurred me to, get involved in the party. Or yes, I used to be on the town council, and then that moved into this position, and that moved me into that position, and whatever. So, but there wasn't this, again, sort of stereotypes of like what we think these politicians look like. That really, it was much more diverse. The other important thing, and again, for me, I think this was maybe a little bit surprising, although I certainly should have known better, is that the party lines that we recognize today between Republicans, between Democrats, between independents, were not as hard in previous eras, and the issues were different. Things that we might resonate with being connected to the Democrat Party were not connected to the Democrat Party in the 1980s. Things that were important to conservatives in this era were not the same things that were important to conservatives in 1990 necessarily. Not to say that everything is totally flip-flopped, but you really saw that fleshed out by a Republican in 1970 saying, I was so concerned about the environment. That was a key part to the Republican Party in Indiana in this era. Things that we don't necessarily, again, see in the modern state of things. One of the questions that we always ask each legislator is, what is it that you want citizens to know about how the General Assembly operates or how they can affect politics? And without fail, they often say these things. The average Hoosier does not understand that the Indiana General Assembly is in fact not the US Congress, and that these folks do not go to Washington, DC for several months every year, and they sort of conflate the two. And in fact, they'll often bring up, can you help me with this issue? And they'll be like, well, I can take your concern, but no, that's a federal issue. We don't actually do that. So they really want folks to know about these different bodies and what the jobs of each actually are. And also there's really a lack of understanding about how state government operates, about how the two houses operate, how the governor's office operates. And there's just sort of a mystique around that the average Hoosier doesn't know. And they really would like there to be more awareness about that. And so they're hoping that in some ways, maybe this project can shed some light. And also that compromise matters. Time and again, we'll hear these stories from legislators. Well, they talk about, we don't get anything passed if you're not actually working across party lines. I always had this buddy in the House that was of a different party and would go to this person to help shepherd my legislation through. And that most of the legislators from previous eras said, you have to do that to be successful. You have to do that to have a functioning body here. And in fact, some of the other lessons is we're not seeing that. And that's what we think is the problem. So again, time and again, folks will say compromise matters. And the other thing that they say repeatedly is your voice matters. If you don't think picking up the phone and calling me and I don't hear that message, like, you're wrong. I pay attention when people call. I pay attention when people email. I may not end up voting that way, but like the more I hear from constituents, prompts me into action. If I don't hear anything from people, then I'm going to do, sort of what I see fit or how I think I should vote. And so they, again, legislators across the board, across parties will say that people do have influence on how legislators respond. So there are several big issues that have really come about after we've amassed 80 plus interviews with, again, legislators across the board. The big takeaway that we have found is that Indiana politics have changed. What we really have seen in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, through maybe the first decade of the 2000s is different than what we are seeing today. This is not me saying this. This is legislators saying this. This is what we are seeing both when we were in office and perhaps why we got out of office, or why we think things are difficult and what we're observing now watching things. That not only have they changed, they have become more polarized. And again, in these eras that we focused on, really from the 70s to the early 2000s, legislators would talk about, and of course you can check this in the historical record, that the majority would flip. We'd have a Republican majority, and then 2 years later, it would be a Democratic majority. Sometimes they were split. Those have been really interesting interviews talking about when the House was 50-50 and they would share speakers. There's some wild stories about things that would happen there. But there was never a supermajority, and a lot of former legislators generally agree that there still isn't, actually, despite the fact that there is. That's another conversation. But also that everyone needed to work across party lines to get legislation passed, that they generally were not crippled by major partisan issues. Yes, they would come up, but a lot of the legislators would say there's always 5 to 7 hot button topics that we know people will get upset about, that are going to cause, hard divisions or hard lines, right? But that those weren't always drawn by party lines. A lot of times with some of these hot button issues, the lines would rather be drawn by urban-rural divides, or like labor versus management versus Democratic-Republican. And not saying that, of course, that still happened to some as well, but it wasn't so entrenched or ingrained as what the legislators thought during their time. And in fact, that they felt like it was a much more collegial environment, that they would have it out on the floor. They'd say what they thought and fight with each other, right? But then they'd go grab a beer afterwards and they would be done, right? Like, this was politics and business, and then I still value you as a human, as a Hoosier, and we're going to figure this out together, right? Legislators consistently across the 80+ interviews provide 3 reasons for this deep partisanship, or the fact that politics have changed over the last few decades. One is gerrymandering, and they will say that blatantly, and they're not really blaming one party over the other, but the party in control every 10 years draws the lines, and they'll talk about that being a political process, and that we've sort of gotten it so out of whack that that's why we have the supermajority, that is actually not reflective of how people vote and what their beliefs are. So again, this is not me promoting that or saying that. This is what the legislators are telling us. The other is money. If you're talking about campaigns for people that ran in the 70s or 80s, they'll say that they maybe raised and or spent a few $1,000s. They're doing pancake brunches at the Legion. And they went door to door campaigning, but there wasn't an influx of money. By the time we get into the 90s, early 2000s, you're starting people tens of thousands of dollars, money coming in from other places, other things, commercials, smear tactics and campaigns. A lot more money is being funneled into state government than used to with the legislature. And then the third part is aggressive politics. There's a really interesting quote, one from Charlie Brown, where he would talk about, again, we'd have it out on the floor, but then we'd go grab a beer and we'd let it go. And, that's what it was. But now you also will have folks, there's another interesting quote from a Republican legislator who just talked about, like, there used to be this recognition that, if we're elected, or if I am running against someone, I'm going to have to face that person. We're Hoosiers. I'm going to see them somewhere else. I'm not going to smear that person necessarily. Here's my issues. Here's their issues. But then talking about, like, the bigger all this got, the more money that funneled in, the more aggressive, the more pressure it became to win. You don't care about that anymore. And in fact, you're so embarrassed about what you said in that campaign, if you see them in the state house or on the floor, you're going to avoid them because you know what you have said, and that could be awkward. And again, there's sort of the pressure to do that, to really go after and to be personal in ways that they didn't at least feel like had been the case previously. So how have we been using this info, right? We've been conducting these interviews for near 5 years now. What have we been doing? One, a lot of public presentations like this. We've presented what we've been finding, or in terms of just how we've organized the oral history project at various conferences. Been presented at an oral history conference, actually in California. I've presented at the Indiana Association of Historians here in Indiana. We present to county historians, other organizations or groups that we think might find this information interesting. Also, we have connected to, there is actually a group called ARMIGA, which is classic, right, acronyms, let me see if I can get this right, Association of Retired Members of the Indiana General Assembly. And they used to meet periodically, so we would meet with them to try to talk about the project and to network and to get more folks involved, right? But we're also trying to take information and snippets from the interviews themselves. And again, kind of like that deep dive or talking about with the Bureau itself, and then translating that and putting it back into public programming or into other resources that folks can use. So just a couple of examples you see here on the Indiana History in Session. For the last 5 or so years, every time the General Assembly is in session, we partner with archives and legislative services to create these little narrative slides that are on the screens outside each chamber of the House. And one that we've consistently doing is pulling snippets from the ILOHI interviews of like lessons that legislators have learned, or what they want current legislators to know, or what they've said about how the state has changed over the past however many years. So you can see here for this particular year, we, from every interview we pulled the question of what is the most important work of the legislature, and what is it that former legislators are advising in that capacity, essentially. We're also pulling tidbits to put in our almanac entries that we then use for our social media to again promote the project, but also just interesting things we're learning. Also writing in-depth blogs from either particular interviews themselves about stories that legislators are sharing, or trends like here's what legislators think is happening, causing politics to change. So how can educators, how can other librarians, how can other folks utilize this project themselves, right? So one is this ILOHI in schools that we've talked about. Ben had first went into high school classrooms, but then also into college classrooms. We could do presentations at libraries. We could partner with former legislators and other organizations to come into spaces, talk about the project, provide brief bios on the legislators themselves, and then sort of conduct a formal, informal interview about what their service was like. We can pull snippets from what we've already learned from our interviews with them, or new stuff that they're wanting to talk about, right? Also, you can listen to the interviews in full. They are all online, or most of them are online that we have conducted, and about 25% have searchable transcripts, right? So we still have a backlog of working through our transcripts, but those are available so students can read, you can read. You can use them in a variety of ways, pull snippets for your own projects, for your own research, for your own exhibits. You can also highlight legislators from your district or pull comparisons from eras, from parties, from what have you. You can also use these in terms of publications. Again, we're hoping that other researchers will come in that are interested in state government or comparing state governments. You can also pull information to teach students about how the General Assembly and the state government works. We'll often ask each legislator about, like, what was the first bill you proposed? Walk us through that process. What does that look like? Who did you work with? How do things operate, right? So we've got 100 different stories of them walking us through that process, which I think is really important. And it's in their own words, right? Also, it's important to use or to take what legislators wish the public knew about government and how we can how the public can influence it. Right? We have those core questions that we're asking every single person. So every single person is getting asked that question about what can the public do if you don't like how government is operating, or you want to push forward an issue or lobby for something. Here's how to do it. The legislators are telling you, at least during their era, this is what influenced me. This is how I operated. And then also we are putting out supplemental resources, right? So we have a series of blogs that we have done, pulling from the oral histories, the almanac entries. Ben, before he left, produced a mini document kind of about those big issue lessons that we have learned, using audio snippets from the interviews. So we're happy to share those, happy to make sure that researchers can get in and use this information as well. So we are moving into phase 3 of the project, sort of where I see the ILOHI going. As I mentioned, Ben recently left, so we're getting ready to hire a new oral historian to take this project into phase 3 and into the final level. Not final level, this is not going away. Into the next level, sorry. Into the future here. One is I still want to double down and make sure we get through the backlog transcripts. Like I said, about 25% have been fully transcribed. We have adopted a new transcription software that does help the process go more quickly, but you still have to go through and check it as well. Also, I would love to annotate the transcripts, so at least for those that were in like leadership positions. So when they're talking about this bill, then we provide hyperlinks out to where you can read more about it, or here's the link to it in the digitized like history journal or what have you. Also, more outreach, right? We've been really sort of heads down in a lot of ways, getting through as many interviews as we can with folks that we needed to talk with. But now I want to kind of come out of that and spread the word of the project. I want to make sure that the public is aware that we're here and making use of these resources and partnering with other organizations that we might, that could have a successful partnership with, right? And then the final two things that I really want to focus on in this sort of next phase of the project are enhanced educational tools and curriculum. Now that we have the online archive, we have the interviews digitized, right? I would love to create like a database or something where here's what every legislator said about issue X, right? Here's what they all said about Unigov, or here's what they said about what. And so you could very easily pull those snippets out, but also maybe create like an interactive timeline pulling across the interviews of here's key events in legislation that's happened over the past 40 years, or here's these important trends or shifts, moments where we're seeing things, move in a different direction. I would also love to really create some lesson plans connected to standards for 4th grade history or for high school now that we have the Indiana history course, things like that. And then also create more short videos or mini essays that can be used in the classroom or libraries, other presentations as well. So that is all I have to say for the moment. I hope that there are lots of questions. I'm obviously very passionate about it, a personal project, and really want to see it be successful. And so I'm happy to open it up to questions either in person or from Kara online. I have just done such a great job. No one has any questions, I'm sure. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rick Chapman for the University. A couple of questions for you.
Yeah.
Are you interviewing any staff who engage in long-term service with legislators? Because they can be very valuable resources. You want to interview retired staff. Secondly, are you interviewing General Assembly members now on the role that social media is playing, in how they interact with constituents and in overall state government policy?
Yeah, so let me repeat that question real quick for those folks that are online. A gentleman from Purdue asked a question in terms of whether we are interviewing long-term staff that has been affiliated with the General Assembly or connected but not actually legislators themselves. And then secondly, are we specifically asking about how social media and/or technology has influenced or changed the process or their service? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. So to the first one, I have informally interviewed long-term staff. There was a woman who served, she was not a secretary, it was like a different title, but essentially had been around and was like, her nickname was the Queen because essentially everything that happened in the General Assembly had to go through her first. So I have talked with people, particularly in that introduction phase, or foundational phase, to make sure I knew how things worked and to sort of get inside scoop of like who I needed to talk to and what were questions to ask. So we did that informally with her and a variety of other people. At this point, because we had such a backlog, or not backlog, but dozens, hundreds of legislators who had not been interviewed, we prioritized first interviewing legislators. I am open to the idea of other folks that have been around the legislature or were influential in the future as another phase perhaps, but we have not explicitly done that yet. That is a good idea, one I will take with me. The other, in terms of social media, I know that we ask pretty frequently how technology has changed and affected the legislation. I can remember there's several interesting stories about Bob Garton, who is the longtime pro tem, of the Senate of when they brought in computers for voting and how that affected things and change. I don't know that we've asked explicitly about social media, but one of my ideas for as we bring in a new historian is to maybe also update or add a few additional questions to that core interview guide, or to be more explicit, because I know we've been asking about technology, but I don't know that we've said social media specifically. But that's a great point, because I know from our own social media pages, there are lots of positives and negatives that can come from that. And I'm sure legislators experience the same. And there's also a lot of issues about what is like public record or public document from social media, and like what you can block or not block. And those are issues that we grapple with, and I'm sure that they are as well. So that's a great thing to consider. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, Marcia.
Are the transcripts keyword searchable, or are they going to be keyword searchable?
They are searchable in the sense, I think that they are like PDF or Microsoft, and you can search that way. They do not have like OCR metadata on top of it yet, but that is a great idea also for the future of something that we could do, because that would make them much more accessible. We're also considering putting the interviews as another sort of safeguard and measure to reach a different audience into like Indiana memory. And then that would have that process with it as well. So we're not there yet, but we could be. That's a good question. Oh, and I should have repeated that question, were they keyword searchable? And they are, in the sense of if you're using a PDF or a Microsoft document, but not in the sense of like official software metadata searchable in that regard. Yeah, so we still have a few more minutes if there are other questions. None online. Okay, well, I will end it here. I'll hang around for a few minutes if anybody has any questions, but thank you so much for being here today and for attending this session.
Please be sure to check out our vendors in the hall. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Appreciate it.